John Keats. John Keats's father was head stableman at a London livery stable. He married his employer's daughter and inherited the business. The poet's mother, by all reports, was an affectionate but negligent parent to her children. Remarrying almost immediately after a fall from a horse killed her first husband, she left the 8-year-old John, her firstborn, his brothers, and a sister with their grandmother and did not re-enter their lives for 4 years. The year before his father's death, Keats had been sent to the Reverend John Clark's private school at Enfield, famous for its progressive curriculum, where he was a noisy, high-spirited boy. Despite his small stature, when full-grown, he was barely over 5 feet in height. He distinguished himself in sports and fistfights. Here he had the good fortune to have as a mentor Charles Cowden Clark, son of the headmaster, who later became a writer and an editor. He encouraged Keats's passion for reading and, both at school and in the course of their later friendship, introduced him to Spenser and other poets, to music, and to the theater. When Keats's mother returned to her children, she was already ill, and in 1810 she died of tuberculosis. Although the livery stable had prospered, and £8,000 had been left in trust to the children by Keats's grandmother, the estate remained tied up in the law courts for all of Keats's lifetime. The children's guardian, Richard Abbey, an unimaginative and practical-minded businessman, took Keats out of school at the age of 15 and bound him apprentice to Thomas Hammond, a surgeon and apothecary at Edmonton. In 1815, Keats carried on his medical studies at Guy's Hospital, London, and the next year qualified to practice as an apothecary surgeon, but almost immediately, over his guardian's protests, he abandoned medicine for poetry. This decision was influenced by Keats's friendship with Leigh Hunt, then editor of The Examiner, and a leading political radical, poet, and prolific writer of criticism and periodical essays. Hunt, the first successful author of Keats' acquaintance, added his enthusiastic encouragement of Keats's poetic efforts to that of Clark. More important, he introduced him to writers greater than Hunt himself, William Hazlitt, Charles Lamb, and Percy Shelley, as well as to Benjamin Robert Hayden, painter of grandiose, historical and religious canvases. Through Hunt, Keats also met John Hamilton Reynolds and then Charles Wentworth Dilke and Charles Brown, who became his intimate friends and provided him with an essential circumstance for a fledgling poet, a sympathetic and appreciative audience. The rapidity and sureness of Keats's development has no match. Although he did not begin writing poetry until his 18th year, by 1816 in the bold sonnet, On First Looking into Chapman's Homer, he had found his voice. Later that same year he wrote Sleep and Poetry, in which he laid out for himself a program deliberately modeled on the careers of the greatest poets, asking only, "For 10 years, that I may overwhelm myself in poesy, so I may do the deed that my own soul has to itself decreed." For even while his health was good, Keats felt a foreboding of early death and applied himself to his art with a desperate urgency. In 1817, he went on to compose Endymion, an ambitious undertaking of more than 4,000 lines. It is a rich allegory of a mortal's quest for an ideal feminine counterpart, and a flawless happiness beyond earthly possibility. In a number of passages, it already exhibits the sure movement and phrasing of his mature poetic style. But Keats's critical judgment and aspiration exceeded his achievement. Long before he completed it, he declared impatiently that he carried on with the slipshod Endymion only as a trial of invention, and began to block out Hyperion, conceived on the model of Milton's Paradise Lost, in that most demanding of forms, the epic poem. His success in achieving the Miltonic manner is one of the reasons why Keats abandoned Hyperion before it was finished, for he recognized that he was uncommonly susceptible to poetic influences and regarded this as a threat to his individuality. "I will write independently," he insisted. The genius of poetry must work out its own salvation in a man. He had refused the chance of intimacy with Shelley, that I might have my own unfettered scope. He had broken away from Leigh Hunt's influence, lest he get the reputation of Hunter's élève, pupil. Now he shied away from domination by Milton's powerfully infectious style. In sentimental, later 19th century accounts of poor Keats, 1818 was cast as the year in which this rising genius, already frail and sensitive, was mortally crushed by vicious reviews. Percy Shelley helped initiate this myth in Adonais, which describes Keats as a pale flower. Byron, who did not like Keats's verse, put it unsentimentally. Keats, he wrote, was snuffed out by an article. It is true that the critics were brutal to Keats, those associated with the Tory journals especially. For them, his poetry proved an irresistible target, precisely because it had been promoted by the radical Hunt. Endymion was mauled in the Quarterly Review, and one of the articles on the Cockney School of Poetry that appeared in Blackwood's magazine condemned Keats as hopelessly vulgar, a writer who wanted to be a poet of nature, but thought, as a social climbing, undereducated Londoner would, that nature was flowers seen in window pots. It is a better and wiser thing to be a starved apothecary than a starved poet, the reviewer scolded. So back to the shop, Mr. John. Keats had for his own part the good sense to recognize that the attacks were motivated by political prejudice and class snobbery, and he had already passed his own severe judgment on Endymion. My own domestic criticism, he said, has given me pain without comparison, beyond what Blackwood or the Quarterly could possibly inflict. More important was the financial distress of his brother George and his young bride, who emigrated to Kentucky and lost their money in an ill-advised investment. Keats, short of funds and needing to supplement the family income, had now to find ways to make money from his writing. He turned to journalism and began planning plays. His brother Tom contracted tuberculosis, and the poet, in devoted attendance, helplessly watched him waste away until his death that December. In the summer of that year, Keats had taken a strenuous walking tour in the English Lake District, Scotland, and Ireland. It was a glorious adventure, but a totally exhausting one in wet, cold weather, and he returned in August with a chronically ulcerated throat made increasingly ominous by the shadow of the tuberculosis that had killed his mother and brother. And in the late fall of that same year, Keats felt unwillingly but deeply in love with Fanny Braun, the 18-year-old girl next door. They became engaged, knowing, though, that Keats's poverty and worsening health might well make their marriage impossible. In this period of turmoil, Keats achieved the culmination of his brief poetic career. Between January and September of 1819, masterpiece followed masterpiece in astonishing succession. The Eve of St. Agnes, La Belle Dame sans Merci, and all of the great odes, Lamia, and a sufficient number of fine sonnets to make him, with Wordsworth, the major romantic craftsman in that form. All of these poems possess the distinctive qualities of the work of Keats's maturity: a slow-paced, gracious movement, a concreteness of description in which all the senses, tactile, gustatory, kinetic, visceral, as well as visual and auditory, combine to give the total apprehension of an experience, a delight at the sheer existence of things outside himself, the poet seeming to lose his own identity in a total identification with the object he contemplates, and a concentrated facility of phrasing that reminded his friends, as it has many critics since, of the language of Shakespeare. Under the richly sensuous surface, we find Keats's characteristic presentation of all experience as a tangle of inseparable but irreconcilable opposites. He finds melancholy in delight and pleasure in pain. He feels the highest intensity of love as an approximation to death. He inclines equally toward a love of indolence and sensation, and toward a life of thought. He is aware both of the attraction of an imaginative dream world without disagreeables, in the remorseless pressure of the actual. He aspires at the same time to aesthetic detachment and to social responsibility. His letters, hardly less remarkable than his poetry, show that Keats felt on his pulses the conflicts he dramatized in his major poems. Above all, they reveal him wrestling with the problem of evil and suffering. What to make of our lives in the discovery that the world is full of misery and heartbreak, pain, sickness, and oppression. To the end of his life, he refused to seek solace for the complexity and contradictions of experience, either in the abstractions of inherited philosophical doctrines or in the absolutes of a religious creed. At the close of his poetic career, in the latter part of 1819, Keats began to rework the epic Hyperion into the form of a dream vision that he called the Fall of Hyperion. In the introductory section of this fragment, the poet is told by the prophetess Moneta that he has hitherto been merely a dreamer. He must know that the poet and the dreamer are distinct, diverse, sheer opposite antipodes, and that the height of poetry can be reached only by those to whom the miseries of the world are misery, and will not let them rest. He was seemingly planning to undertake a new direction and subject matter, when illness and death intervened. On the night of February 3rd, 1820, he coughed up blood. As a physician, he refused to evade the truth. I cannot be deceived in that color. That drop of blood is my death warrant. I must die. That spring and summer, a series of hemorrhages rapidly weakened him. In the autumn, he allowed himself to be persuaded to seek the milder climate of Italy in the company of Joseph Severn, a young painter. But these last months were only what he called a posthumous existence. He died in Rome on February 23rd, 1821, and was buried in the Protestant cemetery, where Mary and Percy Shelley had already interred their little son William, and where Percy's ashes, too, would be deposited in 1822. At times the agony of his disease, the seeming frustration of his hopes for great poetic achievement, and the despair of his passion for Fanny Brawne compelled even Keats's brave spirit to bitterness and jealousy, but he always recovered his gallantry. His last letter, written to Charles Brown, concludes, "I can scarcely bid you goodbye even in a letter. I always made an awkward bow. God bless you, John Keats." No one can read Keats's poems and letters without an undersense of the tragic waste of an extraordinary intellect and genius cut off so early. What he might have done is beyond conjecture. What we do know is that his poetry, when he stopped writing at the age of 24, exceeds the accomplishment at the same age of Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton.